They pointed and laughed as she walked through the cafeteria, jeering at her thrift store clothes like she was some kind of walking punchline. But 3 weeks later, the same students who mocked her were on their feet, applauding the girl they once tried to break. This is how Keisha Daniels turned their cruelty into a lesson no one would forget. Keisha Daniels had mastered the art of silence, not out of fear, but out of necessity. At Middleton High, a place where designer logos doubled as social currency, her faded gray hoodie and scuffed sneakers made her an easy target. She didn't dress that way to rebel. She dressed that way because bills came before outfits in her household. Her mom worked 2 jobs. Her little brother needed new asthma meds. A name-brand wardrobe wasn't even on the list. Most days, Keisha moved like a shadow, head down, earbuds in, weaving between groups in the hallway without bumping into anyone. But even shadows get noticed eventually, and for some kids at Middleton, someone who doesn't play the game is just another excuse to start one. It began with whispered comments and side eyes, but on the Tuesday of Spirit Week, it turned brutal. Posters went up for something called Fashion Roast, pitched as a fun way to laugh with, not at, your classmates. But Keisha knew exactly who they'd be laughing at, and when she walked into the cafeteria that day, tray in hand, and saw a blown-up photo of herself taped to the vending machine with the words, "Thrift Store Queen," scribbled across it in red Sharpie, she felt something inside her crack. They didn't just insult her clothes, they announced her worth, out loud, to the entire school. And for the first time in a long time, Keisha didn't lower her gaze. She looked up, straight at them. The laughter echoed off the cafeteria walls, bouncing between cliques like a cruel game of catch. Keisha stood still, her tray trembling slightly in her hands, eyes locked on the ringleader, Sienna Morgan, student council vice president, and self-appointed queen of fashion judgment. Sienna was everything Keisha wasn't, polished, popular, and born into a world that didn't require coupons or side hustles. Behind her, a group of students doubled over laughing, one of them pretending to model in ragged clothes, while the others filmed it on their phones. Keisha's face burned, not from shame, but from a heat she hadn't let herself feel in years. She'd trained herself to let it go, to walk away, to focus on what mattered, grades, scholarships, her mom's proud smile when report cards came in. But this wasn't just bullying, it was organized humiliation, public, deliberate, and endorsed by the school under the disguise of student engagement. She walked straight to the vending machine, tore down the sign with slow, steady hands, and tossed it in the nearest trash can. Then, without a word, she turned, walked to her table, and pulled out her notebook. Not to do homework, but to sketch. Ideas. Plans. Something had shifted, and while everyone else laughed, Keisha was already drafting the beginning of something they wouldn't see coming. A response that didn't involve fists or rage, but something far more disarming, her voice. By the end of the day, the fashion roast had its own hashtag. Photos of students in goofy costumes and exaggerated outfits flooded the school's social feed. But Keisha's photo, the one taken without her consent and turned into a joke, was the most shared. In the comments, some laughed, others defended her, but the damage had been done. She sat on the bus ride home, hoodie pulled tight around her face, not crying, but focused. Focused in a way she hadn't been since the 8th grade when she won first place at a citywide youth poetry slam. Back then, she used to write to process pain. Now, she would write to reveal truth. That night, while the school buzzed about who wore what, Keisha stayed up crafting something bigger than a comeback. It was a reckoning. She poured every insult, every side-eye, every ignored complaint into a spoken-word piece called Thread Count. It wasn't just about her clothes. It was about value, about how people like her, kids without perfect polish, were treated like decorations in someone else's hallways, never like the main character in their own story. And then she did something she hadn't done in years. She signed up for the open mic slot at Middleton's upcoming Voices Week assembly, a student showcase organized by the same student council that had started the roast in the first place. Her name was now on the list, and her voice was coming, not to blend in, but to break the silence. The days leading up to the assembly felt like walking through a minefield. Whispers trailed behind Keisha in every hallway, not because of what she wore, but because of what people had heard, that she'd signed up to speak. Some thought it was a joke, others were curious, and a few, like Sienna, seemed nervous in that way people get when they realize their actions might have consequences. Keisha didn't flinch. She spent her lunches in the library, rehearsing every word of Thread Count until the verses felt like armor. Her mom noticed the shift, how her daughters stood taller, how she stayed up later, how the fire in her eyes looked familiar. "Whatever it is," her mom said softly one night, "say it with your whole chest." And Keisha would, because the school that mocked her for being invisible had now given her a spotlight. And this time, she wasn't just going to speak, she was going to be heard. The morning of the assembly arrived with a strange kind of stillness. Keisha sat at the back of the auditorium as students filed in, buzzing with excitement over what was supposed to be another light-hearted showcase of talents, singing, comedy skits, a dance number or two. No one expected anything serious. No one expected her. She wore the same gray hoodie they'd laughed at, not because she didn't have other options, she did, but because she wanted them to see it, see her, own it. Her heart pounded in her chest as names were called and applause echoed. But when the host hesitated slightly before reading hers, the room shifted. "Next up, Keisha Daniels, spoken word." A few chuckles rippled from the front row where Sienna sat, but they were swallowed by the silence that followed Keisha's slow walk to the stage. She took the mic, she looked up, and then, with a voice steady as iron, she began. "You call it cheap, I call it stitched with survival." Her words hit like pin drops in a glass room, clear, sharp, impossible to ignore. She spoke of the hoodie that had been passed down through cousins, worn during hospital visits, job interviews, eviction notices. She painted pictures of closets that held stories, not styles, of mothers working double shifts so their kids could sit in classrooms beside people who would never understand the cost of getting there. She didn't name names, but Sienna's smirk vanished by the second verse. Phones stopped recording. Laughter died. What started as curiosity turned into stillness. The principal leaned forward. Even the teachers, so used to grading from the back, were listening now. "You mock my thread count," Keisha said, eyes sweeping across the room. "But it's not the fabric that makes a person worth seeing. It's the fight in every thread." There were no applause breaks, just unbroken attention, and when she finally ended with, "So, laugh if you want, but I wear my story," loud, proud, and unashamed, the room erupted, not out of pity, but recognition. She stepped back from the mic and saw something she never expected. Sienna clapping, slowly, her eyes wide with something that looked a lot like regret. For the first time since she'd walked into Middleton High, Keisha didn't feel like background noise. She felt like a force. And the funny thing was, she hadn't changed a single thing about herself. She had simply made them see her differently. By the end of the day, the school felt different, not dramatically, but subtly. Like the hallway air had cleared. Students who had never spoken to Keisha before gave her nods, quiet smiles, or stopped her just to say, "Thank you." A few even admitted they'd shared the viral photo, but had deleted it after hearing her speak. The thread count clip made it online by lunch and was reposted dozens of times, first by classmates, then by teachers, and finally by a local youth poetry account that had over 50,000 followers. The comments poured in, not just from students but from strangers. "I needed this. This hit me in the chest. Say it louder." But with the praise also came friction. Sienna avoided her gaze in the halls, and someone anonymously slipped a mocking note into her locker. "Still looks like trash, though." Old habits die hard. But this time Keisha didn't crumple or hide it. She taped the note onto her notebook cover as fuel. Meanwhile, something remarkable began to unfold. Other students, especially those who had been targets for how they dressed, started speaking up. A sophomore named Miguel, who'd been bullied for wearing hand-me-downs from his older sister, asked Keisha if he could write something for the next open mic. A quiet girl from art class left a sketch of Keisha performing with the caption, "Realest outfit in the room." Even the principal called her into his office, not for discipline, but to say that the school had received a wave of messages from parents and local community leaders, praising her courage and suggesting a change in school culture. "I think you've started something bigger than a poem," he said. Keisha didn't smile. She nodded, because that had been the plan all along. Not revenge, not pity, just visibility. And now it was happening. The next day, a bulletin went up outside the auditorium. New Voices Initiative, a monthly space for student storytelling, and beneath it, a quote from Keisha's poem in bold letters. "I wear my story, loud, proud, and unashamed." The ripple became a wave. Within a week, the first New Voices session drew a full house. Students packed into the library, sitting on beanbags, windowsills, and the floor just to hear their classmates speak. And for the first time, it wasn't just the usual performers. It was the quiet ones, the overlooked, the kids who had been side-eyed for thrifted shoes or accents or lunch trays full of food stamps worth. Keisha didn't headline that session. She sat near the back, listening, her hoodie still on, but her posture lighter, more grounded. Miguel shared a piece about translating for his parents in grocery stores. Tasha, a freshman who wore the same 2 jackets all winter, delivered a raw poem about shame and warmth. Even Mr. Lawson, the English teacher, stepped up to say he hadn't realized how many kids walked through Middleton's halls, carrying stories that were never invited to the table. It wasn't perfect. Some students still scoffed, others rolled their eyes, but something had undeniably shifted. More posters went up, this time celebrating individuality. Style is personal, kindness is universal. The student council, perhaps out of guilt or genuine change, invited Keisha to join the planning committee for Spirit Week's replacement. Expression Week, focused on creativity, storytelling, and empathy. And while she accepted the role quietly, she made one thing clear. There would be no roast. Not now, not ever again. Sienna, visibly more subdued these days, nodded in agreement during the first meeting, avoiding eye contact, but not avoiding accountability. Keisha didn't need an apology. She needed action, and slowly she was getting it. When local news caught wind of what had happened at Middleton High, the viral photo, the poem, the student-led reform, they reached out for an interview. At first, Keisha said no. She didn't do this for attention. But after speaking with her mom, who reminded her that sometimes the story isn't just yours, it's someone else's survival plan too, she agreed. The segment aired on a Friday evening, showing clips from the assembly, student testimonies, and a short reading of thread count. By Monday, donations started pouring into the school's underfunded arts program, and a small nonprofit offered to sponsor workshops for low-income students on self-expression through fashion and poetry. Keisha was asked to speak at a regional youth summit 2 towns over. Suddenly, the girl mocked for her clothes had become a face of change, but she never let it swell her ego. She still wore her hoodie, still helped her little brother with math homework, still sat in the back of the bus listening to the same lo-fi playlists on the way home. But the difference now was this. When she walked through the cafeteria, people didn't look at her with pity or mockery. They looked at her with something closer to respect. Not because she'd fought anyone, not because she'd yelled or retaliated, but because she'd stood still in the middle of a storm and spoken the truth loud enough that no one could ignore it. 2 months later, the auditorium was full again, this time for Voices Rising, a district-wide youth arts showcase that had grown out of Middleton's New Voices program. Keisha stood backstage, holding her little brother's hand as he prepared to perform a short poem he'd written about their mom. It was his first time on stage, and she was more nervous for him than she'd ever been for herself. When he finished, the crowd erupted, and Keisha felt her chest tighten, not with anxiety, but with pride. Afterward, a teacher from a neighboring school approached her and said, "Your poem started this whole thing, you know. We used it in our media literacy class. Kids actually asked to study it." Keisha smiled, stunned but steady. What had once been a moment of humiliation in her school cafeteria had become a platform, a blueprint, for students across the district to speak up. Even the school board took notice. The superintendent invited Keisha to consult on a new anti-bullying and inclusion initiative, and she was featured in a campaign that read, "Your voice, your power." That night when she got home, she found a note taped to her bedroom mirror in her mother's handwriting. "Don't ever shrink to fit their silence." Keisha stood there reading it over and over, remembering all the time she had, and promising herself, never again. The next school year, Middleton High looked and felt different. The lockers weren't covered in glossy campaign posters, mocking clothes, or popularity contests. They were decorated with quotes from student poems, affirmations, and art. The new principal, a former counselor, implemented anonymous reporting systems and hosted monthly roundtables, where students led discussions on culture, kindness, and inclusion. But the biggest change wasn't in policies or posters. It was in the students themselves. They had learned to look beyond appearances, to ask questions before judging, and to recognize the quiet strength in those they once ignored. Keisha still wore the same hoodie, washed, a little thinner now, sleeves slightly frayed. But when she passed through the cafeteria, no one laughed. Some nodded, some stopped to talk, and some just watched with quiet respect. During her senior year, she was invited to deliver the commencement speech. Not because she was valedictorian, though she was top 5, but because the school wanted her story to be the final lesson the graduating class carried into the world. She stood at the podium, hands steady, eyes scanning a crowd full of faces that had once dismissed her, and began. "I was never invisible. You just hadn't learned how to see me yet." The crowd held its breath. And then, like the day she first took the mic, they stood and clapped, not just for what she said, but for who she had become. And as she stepped down from the stage, diploma in hand, she knew one thing for sure. Dignity isn't something you buy, it's something you carry. And hers would never go out of style.